to our science seminar in the Niels Bohr Archives series. And a special welcome to the Czech ambassador, as well as to our speaker. And as usual, I will ask you a question first. And the question is there anybody who wants to be on our invitation list but are not on our invitation list? Okay, good. So we'll send this around, the name and email address. Philip Grygar, he has a background in the history and philosophy of science, with an emphasis on Niels Bohr's philosophy of science and Edmund Husserl's and Martin Heidegger's phenomenology. They're all here. This year, he received the prestigious Josef Lauka Award in the Czech Republic for a book that I have lying here, and I could send it around for you who are interested in looking at it, but we really need to get it back to the archive. This event is co-sponsored by the Danish Embassy in Prague, and I am also happy to have the Czech ambassador here, Jiří Brodsky, and he has even helped us promote this event, so it's wonderful. Now we look forward to learning about the approach to Bohr and his thinking in a country that we rarely communicate with in this respect. And I look forward to a continued contact in this respect. And I think I have said enough because I know that Philip has a lot to say too. So the word is yours, Philip.
Thank you for your kind invitation to this famous auditorium and to the Mecca of quantum theory. Surely you remember Marcellus from Hamlet, who said to Horatio that something was rotten in the state of Denmark. But I am convinced that modern Shakespeare would write that something rare was rooted in the state of Denmark when Niels Bohr was born. In my Czech extensive book about Bohr's complementary thinking, I, among others, outlined some parallels between Bohr's philosophy of science and Husserl's intentional and Heidegger's hermeneutic or interpretative phenomenology. And I want to develop this issue much deeper and go far than current discussions about Bohr's philosophy of science are. Firstly, I am going to summarize selected notes to complementarity. Then I am to say something about phenomenology and Bohr's epistemological lesson of quantum theory. After it, I shortly suggest some scopes of phenomenological interpretation of Bohr's conception of complementarity, which is narrowly connected with his notion of two levels of language and phenomenon. And lastly, I intend to demonstrate complementarity as a new epistemological framework with help of graphical scheme. Any quotations I will use, I can give with references to you after lecture. Now, to the first part of lecture. Bohr's idea of complementarity enables to supplement contradictory or incompatible descriptions of a certain phenomenon or problem. However, it needs to be pinpointed that complementarity is not, as traditionally suggested, a scientific principle or specific interpretation. Complementarity also cannot be simply mixed with a paradoxal duality of wave and particle, and it cannot be considered as some sort of derivative of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Complementarity and Bohr's philosophy of science is neither interchangeable for so-called Copenhagen interpretation. Regarding the use of word complementarity, Bohr probably introduced this word in the summer of 1927. but we can trace Bohr's complementary thinking even back to his youth. Young Bohr was greatly influenced by cross-disciplinary discussions organized by his father, experimental physiologist Christian Bohr, who had them in their home. As we know, among the regular guests there was philosopher Harald Hevding, linguist Wilhelm Thomson, and physicist Christian Christiansen. And frequent topic of these disputations was a controversy between mechanistic and vitalistic or teleological approaches to the animate or living nature. Bohr also often witnessed these discussions in his father's laboratory. And Christian Bohr's conclusion of these disputations was that the more we pursue the chemical physical explanation of animate nature, the more essential features of the life or living organisms are lost in such explanation. And on the contrary, the more we pursue only teleological or philosophical descriptions of the living nature, the more we lose the results which can be shown only through mechanistic or experimental approach. And Christian Bohr promotes this, you can say, paradox to the rule in general descriptions or public discussions about the meaning of life or animate nature. And the point is that in this unusual approach rests Niels Bohr's thinking. He was also influenced by Riemann's menu-valued functions, by Hevding, Christian Christiansen, or Edgar Rubin. Bohr was also very cautious to believe in any given presuppositions, and hence he had no problem to put together older or quite new hypotheses which were not compatible. And through this way of thinking, Bohr later solved not only his atomic model. What is complementarity? With the aid of visual demonstration, we can use picture of Rubin vase. Edgar Rubin was Bohr's step-cousin, and as we know, they often debated about philosophical and psychological problems. So, and we can use another picture, it doesn't matter which one. In the picture, in one moment, we can see really sharply and distinctly either the vase or two profiles of a human head. From the profiles, we cannot derive the vase. There is no causal connection to the vase and vice versa. But for a complex understanding of the whole perception of the picture, we must take into account both exclusive ways of perception. The same case holds in the quantum theory for meaningful understanding of the wave-particle duality of light or matter, or for complementing exclusive experimental arrangements. That completion is, according to Bohr, an abstraction. Complementarity can serve also as a heuristic approach, for instance, in biology, for complex understanding of the phenomenon of the life, or genes, for complex understanding of the climate change, maybe refugee problem, and so on. Generally, we can define Bohr's idea as an epistemological framework this way. A phenomenon may be comprehensively described by means of two mutually exclusive languages, ideas, concepts, models, etc., language A and language B. One aspect of the given phenomenon may be understood by means of LA, and another by means of LB. There is, however, no aspect of this phenomenon which would be describable simultaneously by means of LA and LB. Likewise, it doesn't apply that the examined phenomenon corresponds only to LA or only to LB, and neither that LA is transferable or derivable from LB and vice versa. Now, to the second part of my lecture. From now it will be a little bit tricky, because to say something about complicated phenomenology, and moreover in combination with Bohr, it's a real hazard. However, the meaning of certain parallels between thinkers so different lies in seeing examined issues from disparate philosophical or scientific viewpoints similarly. Generally speaking, both Bohr and Husserl or Heidegger have more or less defined themselves in opposition to the modern subject-object tradition and purely mechanistic or objectivistic modern idea to unify explanation and understanding of nature or reality. So, as we know, ancient and medieval man was essentially fitting in cosmic or providential order everything what that man or some thinker did, for example, searching for truth or purpose of nature, was meaningfully suspended in and developed from this cosmic order. But approximately from 17th century, this searching was replaced by the search for objectivity, because modern man was excluded from that cosmic order. From Descartes, we are aware of ourselves from within, independent on the outer world. And cosmos or order and any event became mere objects for modern scientific research. With this historical process is related Descartes' methodical distinction of soul and body, which was step by step changed on real distinction between consciousness or closed subject on the one side and lifeless bodies or extensive object in space-time on the other side. Further, Descartes' term realitas objectiva, actual content or thinness, objectness of our ideas in our mind, was step by step changed on so-called objective reality out of us, independent reality with inner properties or hidden parameters, which subject can examine independently of his subjective relative experiencing. Einstein, Rosen, and Podolsky wrote this in 1935, I quote, "Any serious consideration of a physical theory must take into account the distinction between the objective reality, which is independent of any theory, and the physical concepts with which the theory operates. In a complete theory, there is an element corresponding to each element of reality." Modern sciences have been built, among others, on those standpoints, of course, together with belief in continuity and causal explanation of any event in nature, which was doubted, for example, by Planck's discovery of quantum of action. Every science, if it is to remain science, must do its specialized research objectively, and thanks to this we achieve fantastic technical achievements and rapid progress. Objective is everything standing in the opposition to closed subject or consciousness, like things, numbers, words, theory. So objective is positively describable, thinkable, teachable, and real. And Heidegger quoted Planck's statement, I quote, "Real is what can be measured. Everything else, like a question of sense of being or nothingness, is nothing, is not real, and it is not it's not interesting for proper sciences." However, for Bohr, Husserl, and Heidegger, despite persistent scientific efforts to eliminate any inconsistency from unifying ideal of modern science, in everyday life as well as in scientific descriptions, we encounter phenomena which cannot be fully, causally, or unambiguously explained on the basis of modern objective presumptions. There is no only one explanation of light, matter, concept of genes, or our experiencing of space-time, colors, or immovable earth is not the same like physical-chemical explanation. Husserl, Heidegger, Bohr. Husserl, who was originally a talented mathematician, writes in his last work, A Crisis of European Sciences, that modern sciences lost confidence in the ancient idea of universal knowledge as a specific unity of scientific rationality, philosophical rationality, and the ideal of humanity. And according to Husserl, modern objective sciences, neglected and finally forget, reflect their roots in experience pre-scientific activities in the priority of so-called Lebenswelt, life world, or transcendental subjectivity, but it's not so important. Husserl asserts, I quote, merely fact-minded sciences make merely fact-minded people. Science became for him only techne for the application of successive processes of the total mathematization of the nature, and he warned that, I quote, a one-sided rationality can certainly become an evil. Concerning Heidegger, he became seriously interested in the principle of atomic physics due to his early studies in mathematics and physics, and conversation with Werner Heisenberg and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and Heidegger read Pascal Jordan's book and Heisenberg's book and articles. And in Heidegger's analysis of modern science and technology, Heidegger distinguished between Heisenberg's and Bohr's original philosophical thinking and subsequent quantum mechanics. As regards this conventional quantum mechanics, he considers it as the culmination of Wesen, essence of technology. In German, das Gestell. It's not possible to translate it, but it is translated as the inframing or the setup, which is nothing technical, but merely only one dominant way of nowadays thinking and revealing everything. I quote, inframing means the gathering of that setting upon which sets upon man, that is, challenges him force to reveal the real in the mode of ordering as standing reserve. It's Heidegger, but don't remember it, it's okay. It's not important for you. By this, for Heidegger, encompassing calculative thinking, rechnende Denken, and thoughtlessness, Gedankenlosigkeit, science doesn't think, is Heidegger, because it lost ability to engage in meditative thinking, Besinnung, to think in pre-scientific and pre-predicative dimensions, or the existential structure of our being in the world, in der Weltsein. And the concept of world for Heidegger doesn't mean set of things or material world, but instantaneous understanding of anything we do. Without us, there is not some world. Concerning Bohr, he didn't engage in any special kind of philosophy, thanks goodness, but he emphasized an epistemological, philosophical, or general lesson that quantum theory teaches us in relation to the very condition, remember this, to the very condition of understanding, explaining, observing, measuring, and describing nature. And this is closely associated with the critique of modern science based on physical causality and strict subject-object splitting, or as Bohr called it, psychophysical parallelism. Therefore, Bohr attempted to create a suitable, meaningful framework not only for different interpretations of quantum theory, but also for cross-disciplinary research. And this is idea of complementarity. It became the climax of Bohr's long-lasting search for a new unity of knowledge, and as he stressed, I quote, regardless of whether its surface manifestation is via such widely differing human instruments used by a biologist, for example, his father, a physicist, Christian Christiansen, a philologist, Wilhelm Thomson, and a philosopher, Harald Hebden, for example. Simultaneously for him, all our scientific activities are dependent on everyday language. Bohr's last assistant, Åge Petersen, remembers how he used to call attention that we are not able to look beyond our words. Thus, I quote the famous sentence, we are suspended in language. Hence, Bohr, Husserl, and Heidegger as well didn't deal with a problem of objective reality which would precede language, because, as Bohr declared, the word reality is also a word which we must learn to use correctly. It's excellent. And further, he pointed out known statement that, I quote, "It is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature." Excellent. And Bohr applied the same reasoning to other sciences. For example, biology cannot be preoccupied with what life, as he says, or living organisms are, but with the comprehension of what the position of living organisms in our picture of the world is. Again, it's fantastic. And on top of that, I quote, "We can by no means dispense with those forms of perception which color our whole language." It's really important. We can by no means dispense with those forms of perception. What does it mean? Which color our whole language, and in terms of which all experience must ultimately be expressed. So Bohr emphasized that we should be content, like in Husserl and Heidegger's philosophy, with pre-predicative and pre-scientific forms or features which constitute using of our concepts and ideas for any description. Bohr, Husserl, or Heidegger naturally knew that any investigations proceed by virtue of immense reductionism across all fields of study, but this approach, as Bohr warned, implies the danger of prejudice. Modern science, for him, evidently provides, as he says, a deeper insight into our own being, he used being, and our place in existence. But it is only one asserted manifestations of how to understand nature or being. And again, it is a typical Bohr. He realized that the new situation disclosed that, I quote, "In the process, we may have to learn what the word understanding really means." Again, it's fantastic. In other words, with Heidegger, his famous being and time, if I am, it means for me to be. And I'm constantly taking care of it, die Sorge. And if I choose not to wash my hair, not to drink Carlsberg, it's not my case, or to believe in objective reality or to theory of everything, it is only one from numberless possibilities of continually taking care of my being all the time. And thus I constantly somehow understand how to be or our being. So everyday behaving, any intention, religion, hobby, science or mathematics are motivated by that. They are only explicit articulations of this a priori understanding, Verstehen, of the existential structure of our being in the world, in der Weltsein. And those ex post manifestations or objectivizing activities of that Verstehen we call, according to Heidegger, interpretation, or in Greek, hermeneutics. And this is the hermeneutical circle of any interpretation suspended in fundamental understanding of being, from which we cannot exclude. As regards Bohr, he realized that all accumulated problems standing at the birth of quantum theory, the question of language, paradoxical results of experiments and descriptions, problem of continuity, discontinuity, and principal role of conditions of the observable distinction show that, I quote, "It is just this state of affairs which primarily gives to the problems in question their general philosophical interest." Therefore, it was for him also necessary to address other fields of study. For example, I quote, psychology, or even that kind of epistemological problems with which already thinkers like Buddha and Lao Tse were confronted when trying to harmonize our position as spectators and actors in the great drama of existence. And we are back again. It is not possible to be clearly, strictly excluded as closed subjects from closed objects, or fittedness in our perceptions and language, or to be excluded from our theories and experimental arrangements. We are constantly an understood being in the world, or, with Bohr, we constantly understand each other or things as a spectator, actor in the existence. Now, some quotation, longer quotation. Bohr asserted that the distinction between subject and object, necessary for unambiguous description, is retained in the way that in every communication containing a reference to ourselves, we, so to speak, introduce a new subject which doesn't appear as a part of the content of the communication. And Bohr realized that it is just our freedom of choosing, as he says, the subject-object distinction. And this cut is not in nature, but here, in our head. Bohr got the idea of subject-object entanglement, among others, from favorite Paul Muller's book for teenagers, An Dansk Students Eventyr. I'm sorry for my pronunciation, which he quoted frequently, and his colleagues knows that too. In the book, a young man tells this problem. It's fantastic for teenagers. I get to think about my own thoughts of the situation in which I find myself. I even think that I think of it and divide myself into an infinite retrogressive sequence of I's who consider each other. I do not know at which I to stop as the actual, and the moment I stop at one, there is indeed again an I which I stops at it, and my pondering finally results in terrible headache. Book for teenagers. Fantastic. And the physicists in the institute had to study this book because then they knew about something about Bohr's dialectic and interpretation of quantum theory. So, Husserl describes, but in a very complicated way, similar examples, and Heidegger expresses this issue, for example, via his hermeneutical circle. Every interpretation, every behaving, everything what we do is interpretation of our constant understanding of our being, or that I am. Bohr also referred to the similar question of psychological introspection. It is, I quote, clearly impossible to distinguish sharply between the phenomena themselves and their conscious perception. Thus, if we try to analyze our own emotions, we hardly possess them any longer. So, in introspection or reflection, we reduce flowing, spontaneous activity in time, non-object, for example, hearing music, on an object of this reflection, but this objectivizing and description of that is already not the original experiencing of music. Accordingly, Bohr declared that, I quote, words like contemplation and volition, or we can use more words like contemplation, reflection, thinking, and volition, instincts, spontaneity, feelings. These words, like contemplation and volition, referring to situations which are mutually exclusive but equally characteristic of conscious life, have been used in a typical complementary manner since the very origin of language. It's fantastic. Incredible, really. In conclusion to this part, phenomenology contemplates the relation between our activities and their object. I see something, I remember something, I count something, I do this or that all the time, it's intentionally, or hermeneutic correlative pose, and quantum theory discusses the relation from the perspective of interactive systems. So we are not entirely able to determine or distinguish between what belongs, we can say, on the side of an observer with his hair, various pre-understanding and theories, and what belongs on the side of objects, observable or measurable systems. And this situation appeared in extreme position just in quantum mechanics. Similarly, like the problem with speaking about my ego, because I must produce another ego to speak about the previous ego, and so on and so on, any attempt to determine in quantum measurements the interaction between a measurable system and measuring device because of uncontrollable exchange of energy and momentum would require the installation of an additional device. This would again interact with the system under control, and so on and so on. Bohr harshly answered to the Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky article, and he wrote that the new situation in fact discloses only an essential inadequacy of the customary viewpoint of natural philosophy for a rational account of physical phenomena of the type with which we are concerned in quantum mechanics. Indeed, the finite interaction between an object and measuring agencies, conditioned by the very existence of the quantum of action, entails, because of the impossibility of controlling the reaction of the object on the measuring instruments, the necessity of a final renunciation of the classical ideal of causality and a radical revision of our attitude toward the problem of physical reality. And Patrick Gillan, who is both an experienced quantum theorist and phenomenologist, maintains that, I quote, any measurement is a hermeneutic performance, like the playing and replaying of a game, or like a musical or theatrical performance. Now, to the third part of my lecture. I believe that in the case of phenomenological deepening of Bohr's complementarity, it would be possible to introduce this conception in the methodology of science or in education system as a new flexible and cross-disciplinary epistemological framework of thinking or teaching. I was a teacher at gymnasium for 10 years, so I know exactly what I'm speaking about. It is possible. With the continuous growth of new specializations, it is a good idea how to moderate dangerous facultism or pseudosciences, or, as Bohr wrote, bridging extreme modes of materialism, pragmatism, and mysticism in a negative way. Bohr, for example, would have never agreed with a proclamation from the well-known textbook Essential Cell Biology, where is written this: it is to cell biology that we must look for answer to the question of what life is. And I'm not speaking about the Richard Dawkins book. Then phenomenological analysis should first focus on three inseparable notions. Firstly, complementarity. Secondly, phenomenon. Thirdly, language. Now to the first point, and take it easy. It is only for your information what is possible to do with this mixing Bohr and phenomenology. Now to the first point. On the basis of Husserl's and Heidegger's phenomenology, it should be distinguished between, we can say, sharp and non-sharp complementarity. I can say non-sharp complementarity and then sharp complementarity. Non-sharp complementarity means mere complementing of contradictions which are from the beginning somehow mutually dependent. Without one, the second has no meaning. For example, opposite yin-yang, which Bohr has in his coat of arms, life and death, pupil and teacher, complementary coupling of DNA, change basis, velocity and position. Sharp complementarity means a meaningful complementing of phenomena or ideas which are originally or essentially exclusive, mutually and causally non-deducible. Without one, the second is still own meaning, and their completing raised in a new or some special situation. For example, quantum experimental arrangements, wave and particle, phases and waves, instinct and introspection or reflection, perhaps justice and charity or mercy. And in my opinion, the complementarity of requiring pairs or opposites is not really philosophically interesting, because many philosophers handled with this issue, from Heraclit to Hegel, for example. However, sharp complementarity is sovereign philosophical question, and thinkers interested in Bohr still doesn't distinguish between these two kinds of complementarity. Now to the second point. Through Husserl's conception of intentionality, we can deepen Bohr's description of phenomena that appear, as Bohr used to say, in context of the whole of the experimental arrangements, that is an entire complex of visible or describable compartments, that is measuring instruments, microscopic dot left after some particle, including observer and his theory. So, I will take it easy. There is flower, but we can use microscopic devices, instruments, or dot left after the particle. So, this is a dimension of our seeing something and thinking something in our head, dimension of appearing there in my consciousness. Bewusstsein, conscious of being, or in English, consciousness, is related to something, is intentional. So, intentio, intentum, cogito, cogitatum. Activity and objects, act of seeing the seen, smelling the smell, thinking the thought, etc., etc. And instead of flower, we can put instruments or dot left on a detector. So, according to this, of course, it's much more complicated in phenomenology. According to this, an electron is not an existing object independently of us, nor solely product of measurement, but it is an intentional object there in our consciousness, that is the ontic phenomenon constituted within an innumerable intentional synthesis of transcendental subjectivity or consciousness as such. And through Heidegger's, another point, through Heidegger's hermeneutic phenomenology, we can deepen Bohr's notion of inexplicability of the primordial performance of the living or dimension of the very conditions of thinking, observation, or description. And these non-objective, or according to Heidegger, ontological phenomena constitute the cycle structure of our pre-understanding for any interpretation of our intentional behavior, thinking, proposing theories, experiments, etc. Then, in the light of the ontological phenomena, the electron is interpreted within physical pre-understanding and ontological or a priori understanding of being in the world, or with Bohr, it is interpreted within spectator-actor circle in the great drama of existence. Now to the third point. Similar like in previous point, it is needful to distinguish between, in Bohr's philosophy of science, two dimensions of language or understanding. By means of Heidegger's hermeneutic analysis, we can better comprehend we can say point A. Oh yeah, point A. Bohr's emphasis on the indispensable use of classical terms in quantum theory or in any objective description because of our settlement in language. This is explicit or predicative level of language, and for Heidegger in Being and Time it is die Sprache. But Heidegger subsequently says that, I quote, the existential ontological foundation of language is discourse, die Rede. And this is connected with Bohr's another or deeper level of language, that is point B, Bohr's insight to the very conditions or pre-predicative dimension of articulation and understanding of our being or to be. This is insight to the implicit framework of any explicit language, including mathematics. And in Being and Time, discourse, die Rede, together with that a priori understanding, die Verstehen, is ontological character of existence structure of being in the world, or with Bohr or spectator actor in the existence. Bohr gives examples with a function of our organs or with any treatment of a thing, like for example stick, long stick. And to distinguish between explicit, ontic, objectivizable level on the one hand, and implicit or ontological dimension of primordial livingness or our understanding of being on the other hand. I quote, thus, we are normally unconscious of our respiration and the beating of the heart and hardly aware of the working of our muscles and bones during the motion of our limbs. In this situation, these organs are not objects. They are not reflected. We use them. We don't reflect them. Or when we find our way in a dark room only by means of touch of a stick, Bohr says, we lose the sensation that it is foreign body. And the impression of touch becomes immediately localized at the point where the stick is touching wall or floor. But when the stick is held loosely or something happened with the stick, it means at that moment that we don't use the stick, but it appears to us a mere object. In Heidegger's words, implicit pre-predicative understanding of our organs or stick or anything lies in our ultimate activity or practical usage. As soon as we just have something before us as a mere object, it means for him a situation of a failure to understand it anymore. This lack of understanding or a priori understanding requires change of attitude. Organs or the stick ceases to serve their primary purpose, like heart failure or stick is broken or some Czech person stolen that stick in Wenceslav Square in Prague. It doesn't matter. And they suddenly become objects of our reflection that can be manipulated, recovered, repaired, scientifically examined, etc. And every science is interested in these ex post objects. Phenomenology is interested in these implicit sources for these explicit objects or explanation of these objects or nature, and Bohr is interested in both of these levels, in both. Now, the last picture. Oh no. Yes. Here I use Patrick Hieland's diagram. So for obtaining the complex understanding of some studied problem or phenomenon, we can say LA, BC, and for example, phenomenon of the living. There are three or more equally necessary and to a certain extent mutually exclusive ways of description or specific languages, theories, LA, LB, and LC. And LA, LB, and LC with upper comma advert to contexts which somehow intervene or influence crosswise those three approaches, and each meaningful, not stupid, meaningful language description theory makes accessible from own point of view some features to which the other languages, theories, descriptions only refers or eliminate them. And L0 is a dimension of being in the world, or with Bohr, actor spectator in the existence, as implicit source of our infinite interpretative activities for our behaving and any description of something. And everything takes place in the hermeneutic circle L0, LA, LB, LC to LABC, and again L0, and so on and so on. Some examples. As Bohr, after his father, proposed, we can say LA. LA can be mechanistic interpretation of living nature where life is limited to the physical chemical regularities. But life is not just an execution of a program written in DNA and through genetic code, like in cell biology. This imagined reduction of life should be complemented by, for example, LB, which can be, as Bohr writes in his articles, teleological interpretation for understanding of various levels of the life as purposeful complexity interacting within its surroundings with other atoms or living systems for maintaining of the complexity of the life. And LC, LD, LE can be, as Bohr used to say, I quote, strings of emotion, poetry, painting, and music. Or else, as Bohr and Delbrück reflect how to comprehend complex electrons, atoms, and molecules. I quote, an experiment for preparing a chemical compound, LA, is exclusive or complementary to an experiment for measuring the orbits of the electrons generating the bond, LB. If I do LA, I can't do at the same time LB. Or Heidegger says, this sentence is normal, you can say, color shines and wants only to shine. If we try to make it comprehensible by analyzing it into numbers of oscillations, it is gone. It shows itself only when it remains undisclosed and unexplained. It is again like with automatic using things or unawareness of our organ, which is the ontological or non-objective understanding or a priori understanding of our being. Ex post description of the object, some color, is a failure to understand it anymore. Not only that, our everyday descriptions of colors, we can say LA, is influenced, of course, from education by context of physics, LB with upper comma, which explains colors from viewpoint of wavelengths or frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. This we can say is LB. But LB is not color in its appearing experiencing, and vice versa. Sophisticated and fantastic physical explanation LB is influenced by LA with upper comma, that is context of everyday subjective relative experiencing of colored sense, of our understanding of being in the world. Before physicists begin to examine color, they must already understand what is experienced color, wave or length. And those LA, LB, LC, LD, those complementary descriptions, LA, LB, LC, are within their context irreducible, real, true, and excellent. And last example, Heisenberg pictures what Bohr one day mentioned about famous Kronborg Castle or Elsinore. Isn't it strange how this castle changes as soon as one imagines that Hamlet lived here? As scientists, we believe that a castle consists only of stones and admire the way the architect put them together. The stones, the green roof with its patina, the wood carvings in the church constitute the whole castle. We can say LA or objective or ontic phenomena. None of these should be changed by the fact that Hamlet lived here. And yet it is changed completely. Suddenly the walls and the ramparts speak a quite different language. LB, we can say, drama of our existence or being in the world. The courtyard becomes an entire world. A dark corner reminds us of the darkness in the human soul. We hear Hamlet's to be or not to be. And final note, I agree with the statement which Bohr had in last conversation with Thomas Kuhn and his colleagues. The day before Bohr passed away, he compared complementarity to the Copernican revolution, which has step by step gained a privileged position in the education system. And Bohr said, I think it will be exactly the same with the complementary description. Thank you.